Is overcome evil with good. And the theme verse this week comes from Romans chapter 12, verses 20 and 21. And it just takes a couple segments out of each verse. It says, "Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink." And then from verse 21, "Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good." And as I was thinking about this, I was like, man, my boss has been giving me a soda on my desk in the morning. Am I being an evil guy towards him? And he's trying to pacify it? No. But so someone gives you a drink of cold water, and you'd be like, uh-oh, have I wronged this person? But that's just the way my mind works. But it has been encouraging as I studied through these lessons and verses I've heard my entire life and stuff taught on. As I read through it, I'll read through it at one point in the week, sometimes several times, and then usually every Sunday morning I'll sit down and look through it again. And the Lord still gives me new thoughts and new verses to write in the margin, and even some this morning. And it's just, don't you just enjoy it when you're spending time with the Lord and He gives you verses that, I never thought about that, or it gives you an understanding in something you didn't before. So as we continue on in this series, it's not what you think. And a lot of times we hear concepts from the world, and even sometimes growing up we hear church culture teach us one thing, but when we study it out, the Bible says, no, that's not what that means. And you're like, And a lot of times the world will throw parts of verses at you, like judge not, right? And you're like, well, read the rest of the verse and see what they're actually talking about. So it's just encouraging as we go through this that the Lord's still showing me, and having been in church and grown up for 30 years under the preaching of the gospel, just to have the Lord still show me things and teach me things. And sometimes it's for this point in my life, and the Lord said, this situation over the last couple of weeks, this is how this applies to that. And it's like, this is practical. And so as we get into this, all the verses pretty much are in the handouts with this series, so there won't be a lot of slides for that. And so we'll go ahead and pray and get right into the lesson this morning. And the coffee's good, the snacks are good, the temperature's good. Maybe a little warm for me, but it's good. And I was just talking with a gentleman. He just came back from the Middle East, and he's like, it's kind of cold. He's like, I'm used to 110 every day. And I was like, well, if you stand in the sunlight, you'll get warm. But all right, we'll go ahead and pray. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this morning. We thank you for this series that we can study. It's not what we think. And Lord, help us to understand what your word really says about these various situations in our lives and how we can apply them even in our daily lives from today forward. And Lord, I just thank you for how you've been even teaching me through this series of things that are going on in my life, whether it's been in the past or currently transpiring. And Lord, I just ask that you speak to our hearts this morning. I ask this in your precious and holy name. Amen. So as we look at this lesson on overcome evil with good, it kind of plays into the last several lessons. But as we look at this, these are the ones that people have actually done us harm, physical harm, maybe mental or emotional harm as well. But in our society, and we've looked at this over the last couple of weeks, that often it shows that it praises seeking revenge or getting revenge or exacting revenge upon a situation. And oftentimes we mistakenly assume that getting revenge will make us feel better and help us to recover. But we're going to see this morning as we look at this that God's way of getting back at those who cause us injury is overcoming evil with good. And so as we look at this, we'll see a couple things. The text verse comes from Romans chapter 12, verses 18 through 21. And it says, "If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good." This may be one of the more challenging lessons that, as we apply it to our lives, that goes contrary to our flesh, contrary to what the world teaches. And And as I was looking at this and thinking about it, Matthew chapter 5 and verse 38, the Lord reminded me of that, and it says, "Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, that ye resist not evil whatsoever, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also." And I was talking with my wife about this verse this morning, and sometimes we think about someone smiting, like come up and just like sucker punching us on the right cheek. But it's more of an insult, and if you think about like the old movies when they come up with a leather glove and they're just like pow pow, I challenge you to a duel, and so it's more of an insult. And when someone insults us or offends us, do we retaliate with a verbal or insult back, or do we just let them come at it again? And as I was thinking about that, even this morning, how many times has someone said something maybe bad about us and we do nothing, or we just say, you know what, okay, I'll accept that, or we do good to that person, and other people see that, so when that person starts to say, like, oh, do you know what this guy is? They're like, no, that's not what we see, and actually you're the bully, and they're like, oh, take the wind out of their sails. But as we look at overcoming evil with good, we'll see how the Lord will handle the situations as they come up. Our natural inclination when someone has wronged us is to try to get even. Oftentimes when we see small children fighting, we're like, well, why did you hit them? Well, they hit me first. And we think we have to retaliate, or someone has done us wrong. But God tells us that we're to turn the other cheek, that we're not to seek revenge. There's a story from some military back in the day. It says a young boy in Korea was a household boy for some American soldiers. Sometimes they thought it was funny to play harmless jokes on him. They would tease him, tie his shoestrings together, and lock him out of the house. Eventually they realized that the boy did not find their practical jokes funny, and they apologized. And then the boy replied, "That's okay, I'll stop spitting in your soup now." And so just think about that when you're not being nice to someone. And humanly, we think it's impossible to repay evil with good, and it's not in our own strength to do that. We'll fight it, but we have to trust the Lord and rely on His strength to help us and obey His command. And just like last lesson, we looked at David. We're going to continue to look at David and his example that we see from 1 Samuel. And we know that David was a godly man, and that he was chosen to be the king of Israel early on as a teenager, and that he was walking with God. And that Samuel anointed him king over Israel, but his reign obviously didn't start immediately. In 1 Samuel 16:13 it says, "Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah." And as we study, we see that David, he served King Saul as his private musician. He played the harp when the evil spirit would come upon Saul, and when he was distressed. And if we see that in 1 Samuel 16:23, and it says, "And it came to pass when the evil spirit from God was upon Saul, that David took an harp and played with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the evil spirit departed from him." And we know that David showed up to the battlefield and saw the Philistine and Goliath taunting Israel, and that no one was willing to stand up against him. We see that David took it that the Lord used him to fight Goliath and to kill him and to have the victory over him. And so a lot of what we see is going to come from this instance this morning. In 1 Samuel 17:32, and then verse 50 to 51, it says, "And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him," talking about Goliath. "Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine." So David prevailed over the Philistines with the sling and with the stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him. And there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine, and took his sword and drew it out of the sheath thereof, and slew him, and cut off his head therewith. So we see that David is willing to stand, and he was victorious in battle against Goliath, and he fought this. And we know that Saul didn't go out, but Saul offered his armor, and all this that transpired. But we see that as a result of this, we think that a lot of good would come to David for having a victory in the over the battle that day, and inspiring the remainder of the Israelites to fight after that. But we see that Saul becomes jealous as he hears people lavish David with praise. Now, if you read early on, you'll know that Saul did fight different battles and had victorious, and that's, you see that later on when Saul's and his sons are killed, and the men go and retrieve his body of those that he helped protect. But we'll see how jealousy comes into Saul, and he decides to kill David as a result of this. And in 1 Samuel 18, 6 through 9, it says, "And it came to pass as they came when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women came out of all the cities singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tabrets, with joy, and with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played, and said, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. And he said, They have ascribed unto David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed but thousands. And what can he have more but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day forward." Oftentimes we may be in a situation where we're helping someone, or we help someone, we do good, but that very person that we helped and did good to sees it as an attack on maybe, oh, they're going after my job, they want my position, oh, they want all the glory. And we know that in this case that wasn't David, and oftentimes it's not the case in our lives, but we'll see people feel threatened by maybe something that we do. Sometimes you'll see it in a workplace where you have a boss or someone else that feels threatened because they feel like you're doing a better job than they are, and they're going to be like, do you know what, this guy's coming for my job, so I'm going to do everything I can to hinder them or not help them. And so as we look at this, we'll see how David and what the Lord used in David's life to help him do this. But we also see that after defeating Goliath, David continued to play for Saul when that evil spirit came upon Saul. And we see that twice Saul attempts to kill David by throwing a javelin at him. And we see the first instance in Luke 18:11, or Luke 18:11, 1 Samuel 18:11. And it says, "And Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And David avoided out of his presence twice." So we see that Saul, filled with envy, made it his life mission to kill David, to seek after him. And in 1 Samuel 19, verse 1, it says, "And Saul spake to Jonathan his son, and to all his servants, that they should kill David." And we know that for years David spent time running from Saul and hiding and avoiding him. And although David had sincerely served Saul sought David's life. And on two different occasions, David had the opportunity to kill Saul. And the first time we see him, we'll get to here in a second. But the first time was in 1 Samuel 24, and the second time in 1 Samuel 26. But David recognized that it was not his right to vindicate, to seek revenge, to try to solve the situation, but he was waiting on God to avenge him. And each time David had the opportunity to see that he returns evil with good. And so this leads us to our first point, that when overcoming evil with good, the first thing we have to understand is that to overcome evil by thinking properly. And if anyone knows Brother Brent, you know his saying, stinking thinking, and just the different things that, what are we thinking about? And as I was thinking about this, I can remember when I was learning to drive, and my dad told me that when you look over your shoulder to the left, what do you tend to do? You tend to do that. And he said, when you do that, make sure that you don't turn the wheel when you look over your shoulder to the left. He said, if you need to, put your elbow on the little armrest, and it'll keep you from doing that. And he was telling me different things. And a lot of times where you're looking is where you drive. Now, if you come up to church and you came up Hamishaw this morning, did you see that fence? Someone wasn't paying attention where they were looking. And they went through two people's fences. We saw the truck last night. and it was like a brand new lifted Ram. It looked like a nice one, and it wasn't so nice anymore. And my daughter, I think it was my daughter this morning, like the Ram rammed the fence. And so if you go out and you take a left out of the back parking lot, just look to the left, but don't look too much because you don't want to end up in the same situation. And just the fence all tore up. There was wood everywhere. Someone texted like, hey, just to let you know, there's an accident. There's marked vehicles all in the area. And so just to avoid that intersection. But there's still chunks of wood and all kinds of stuff in the road. But we need to overcome evil by thinking properly. And if we believe the truths that we read in our text verse, then that vengeance belongs to the Lord. And we're to overcome evil with good, and this will help us refrain from taking justice into our own hands. And I had written down Philippians 4:8 and the filter that we should apply all our thinking to. And I believe Pastor or someone referenced it this past week. And just what are we using our thought? What's filtering our thoughts? And what are we thinking about? Are we thinking those things that the Lord wants us to? Or are we thinking on, oh, I know how I'm going to get revenge, or if someone says this is how I'm going to respond? But we need to think first, not the first part of thinking properly is to think properly about ourselves. And so thinking properly about yourself is fill in the blank there. In both instances with David, when he had the chance to kill Saul, we see that his response to Saul's persecution reflects his view of himself in this situation. We see that he calls himself a dead dog, and after a flea in 1 Samuel 24, when it says, and after whom is the king of Israel come out? After whom dost thou pursue? After a dead dog, after a flea. And a dead dog was useless, and it was an offense. And if you think about a flea, it's really nothing. What do you really think? I'm nothing. Why are you coming after me? And then in 1 Samuel 26:20, he says, now therefore let not my blood fall to the earth before the face of the Lord, for the king of Israel has come out to seek a flea, as when one doth hunt a partridge in the mountain. And we see that he's saying, I'm nothing. Why are you coming after me? I'm not coming after your kingdom. And oftentimes someone may get a misconception or a thought comes into their head, and sometimes we do it about a family member or a spouse. And I think I relayed the story that I had a bad dream that my wife had done something that offended me, and I woke up mad at her. And I was like, just so you know, in my dream you did this, and I know you didn't do it, but if I seem irritated today, it's because of my dream that you did this. And so sometimes we get this thought, but like, oh, did you see the way they looked at me? I bet you they're thinking this. And you're like, do I have something on me? Why are they doing that? And it could be just like, you ever get those times when you're just zoned out and you're thinking about something, and you're like, oh, and then someone looks at you, and you're like, did I do something? And you're like, no, I just zoned out. And but do we think the right thing about ourselves? We see David compares himself to a dead dog, to a flea, and oftentimes our natural response to our enemies is to think that we deserve better, that the evil that they have rendered to us isn't justified, and that we should get our reward. And oftentimes we tend to view ourselves more highly than we ought to think. In Romans 12 verse 3 it says, for I say, through the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith. Do we think of ourselves more highly than we ought to? Maybe there's something that we've done at work or we've done for society. We think, do you know what? I am due some reward, some praise. But do we say, do you know what? God gave me the understanding to be able to do that. And if they don't want, we see that's the wrong attitude right there. If I don't receive the praise or the reward, am I content just to know that God knows? And oftentimes we'll see that God will reward us far greater than we could ever imagine for ourselves in this situation. The right view of ourselves will humble us and correct our thoughts that would lead to returning evil for evil. And as I was thinking about that in Genesis chapter 41 verse 33, and this is the story of Joseph. And as I was thinking about it, Joseph had gone through a lot in his life. He was sold by his brothers. He was lied to about by Potiphar's wife and thrown in prison. The butler and the cook, the chef, cook, baker, there it is. I know I get to the right word. Had forgot about him and left him in prison. And then we see that when it does come time and he stands before Pharaoh to give the interpretation, he doesn't say, now if I tell you this, it's going to come with some, I need to get out of prison, I get to keep these clothes, and I need some compensation if I'm going to tell you. But what does he say? He goes through and tells Pharaoh the interpretation, and then he goes, now therefore, let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise and set him over the land of Egypt. And he goes on to say this is how it can benefit. And he didn't seek his own reward. He just gave the interpretation that the Lord had given him. He kept the right spirit. And how does he get rewarded?
Goes to Egypt.
He's the second in Egypt. No one greater saved than, or no one greater saved Pharaoh, right? And so who knows that maybe you're in a situation where someone asks your opinion and you're like, hey, I think that I would be the perfect candidate for this, and you try to build yourself up, or do you say, this is how I can see things playing out, and this is what I would recommend, and then leave it to them and see how the Lord rewards you for doing so. Do we think that we need to have that most prestigious seat? I believe that the Lord talks about it somewhere, seek not the uppermost seats, right? And have you ever been someplace and you sat down and you're like, hey, someone's like, hey, do you know what, that's reserved for this person, can you, and then you have to go sit in the very back, or maybe you're like me and my wife, and she sent it to me, and I thought I'll have to put it in the PowerPoint, that you don't want to be the prestigious up in the front, you don't want to be seen, and she sent me this little thing, and it's from a planner, and it's a schedule of the day, and it's like an introvert shaking hands at church, and it says from like 6 to 9 mentally preparing to shake hands, 9 shake hands, and then from like 9:30 to 1 recovering from shaking hands. And do we seek to be in the back and say, someone's like, hey, do you know what, why don't you come up here and sit with us, or come over here and be like, do you know what, I'd like to sit in the back. That way I can sneak out and no one will know. And Brother Jonathan are in the same boat here. And so do we think highly of ourselves, or are we humble and let the Lord, like he says, lift us up and allow us to be, the praise come from others and not seeking to praise ourselves? So not only do we need to think properly about ourselves, but we need to think properly about others. David chose to view Saul not as an enemy deserving retribution, but as the chosen leader of Israel. God had chosen Saul to be king, and we see that the Lord, and as we all know, the Lord had it all worked out for how Saul's reign would end. But in 1 Samuel 26, verses 10 through 11, it says, David said, furthermore, as the Lord liveth, the Lord shall smite him, or his day shall come to die, or he shall descend into battle and perish. And the Lord forbid that I should stretch forth mine hand against the Lord's anointed, but I pray thee, take thou now the spear that is at his bolster and the cruse of water, and let us go. So David had the opportunity to kill Saul and those that were pursuing him, but he chose not to. And we see how the Lord uses his kind treatment to change Saul's heart in this situation for a time. And as if you continue on reading, you'll see how David calls out to him, and his basically say, hey bodyguard, and he uses his name. You were supposed to protect the king, but look at, where's his spear? Where's his cruse of water? I have it. That was right next to him. I could have taken his life, and you failed at your job, so therefore you are deserving of death. But we know that, and as you read through, Saul recognized David's voice, and Saul acknowledges the wrong in persecuting David, and then invites him back to the court, vowing not to hurt him further, and that's from 1 Samuel 26:21. And it says, then since all I have sinned, return my son David, for I will no more do thee harm, because my soul was precious in thine eyes this day. Behold, I have played the fool, and have erred exceedingly. Now, while Saul had this coming to heart. I don't know what you want to call it, but where he realized his wrong. It was also short-lived. We see that the spirit of jealousy comes back upon him, and he seeks to do David harm again. And oftentimes we fail to see that people who bring us hurt are also hurting themselves. They need to have they have a need for someone to love them and to have relief from their own hurt, just as we do from maybe those persecuting us. Do we view them with compassion and not vindictiveness? Our response ought to be reconciliation, not retaliation. The New Testament tells us that the real battle isn't with those that are doing evil to us, but it's against the source of evil, Satan himself, and that comes from Ephesians 6:12. For it says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." When we overcome evil by thinking properly and we keep this perspective, we see that it helps us see who the real enemy is and trust God to deal with the people who have hurt us. And so that leads us to the second point: overcome evil by doing right. In both instances with David, we see that he chose, instead of doing what was maybe his men were encouraging him to do, to kill Saul, to take his vengeance out, he chose to do what was right, returning good for evil. So several things we can learn from David in this is that we're to commit to doing things right. At David's first opportunity to slay Saul, we see that Saul was in a cave, but instead of killing him, we see David cut a fragment off Saul's cloak and left the cave. He committed justice into the hand of God, trusting him for his deliverance against the persecutor. In 1 Samuel 24, verses 4 and 6, it says, "And the men of David said unto him, Behold, the day of which the Lord said unto thee, Behold, I will deliver thine enemy into thine hand, that thou mayest do to him as it shall seem good unto thee. Then David arose and cut off the skirt of Saul's robe privily. And he said unto his men, The Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch forth mine hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord." So as Saul had gone into the cave, it says to uncover his skirt to use the bathroom, David had the opportunity to ambush him, to kill him, and to get away, but we see he doesn't do so. And then the second opportunity, when they found Saul and his men asleep in the camp, they chose to take the spear and the cruse of water instead of killing Saul. David left vengeance in God's hand and spared Saul's life. In 1 Samuel 26:9 and verse 11 says, "And David said to Abishai, Destroy him not, for who can stretch forth his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? The Lord forbid that I should stretch forth mine hand against the Lord's anointed, but I pray thee, take thou now the spear that is at his bolster and the cruse of water, and let us go." We're not responsible for what others do to us, but we are responsible for how we react in those situations. Just like when the person cuts you off in traffic, do you speed up and cut them off? Or do you say, do you know what, I'm going to slow down and let them get their just reward with that cop hopefully around the corner, or just whatever it may be? Do we say, do you know what, that guy trying to cut in front of you in traffic, and you're like, man, he's only going to save 0 seconds because now the other lane's going to go faster because he left and he's going to shoot back over? Or do you say, do you know what, I got plenty of time, maybe not, but I'll let him get in front of me because I don't want him rear-ending me because he's in a hurry? How do we react? Do we allow vengeance to come to mind, or do we allow someone the Lord's grace to show in our lives in that situation? The world says, well, they did it to me, so I'm going to do it back. The Lord doesn't want us to do that. Don't blame others and don't blame your circumstances. Instead, commit to doing right to honor God. When we render evil for evil, we become victims of the wrong done to us. But when we render good for evil, we experience victory through Christ. So don't be a victim, be victorious. And allow the Lord to get the their due reward, right? Their recompense. Do we allow the Lord to handle it, or do we say, do you know what? I'm going to take care of it. I can remember early on when the kids were little, another senior parent was talking to us, and he would tell us that he's like, when his kids were younger, that one of the children would be offended and hit the other child, and he would talk to him like, well, why'd you do that? Well, he did this, and be like, do you think that mom and dad's punishment would be far greater? Well, yeah, well, because you punished them. Now I have to punish you for punishing them, but they've already got punished. So now you get punished and they're fine. And it was like, do we allow the Lord to handle this situation, or do we say, do you know what, I think I got this one, and I know how to settle this situation best, or do we commit it to the Lord and do what He knows to be right? There's been times, even a few years ago, where I was being threatened with being fired every day, coming from emails if I didn't do certain thing. And I knew the Lord didn't want me to do that, and I had to write a letter and all kinds of things. And then, you know what? I never got fired, and I never had to comply with whatever that standard was. And because I knew that the Lord didn't want me to, and I could just see how the Lord worked it all out. I was going through all this, and at the end of it, I got a promotion and all kinds of stuff. And where it was, if I had done it, would it have been a sin? What it was asking wasn't really, wasn't a sin, but I just knew the Lord was leading me not to do that particular thing. And there may be times in our lives where God leads us in a situation and said, you know what, I don't want you to participate in that activity or go with that situation. It may not be wrong, but it's not what the Lord has for you. And just by doing it, someone say, well, everyone else, or there's nothing in the Bible that's against that. But you'll see how the Lord will bless you for obeying Him in that situation. So we need to commit to doing things right, but we also need to commit to making things right. Saul had no good reason for going after David the way he did, other than it was just his jealousy and his perceived, or what he perceived David was after, but that wasn't what David was after. And David tried to make things right in 1 Samuel 26:19. As he's talking to Saul, he says, now therefore I pray thee, let my Lord, the king, hear the words of his servant. If the Lord have stirred thee up against me, let him accept an offering. But if it be the children of men, cursed be they before the Lord. For they have driven me out this day from abiding in the inheritance of the Lord, saying, go, serve other gods. We see David was communicating that if he had done something wrong, that he wanted to make it right. And he wanted to make it right with Saul. So instead of hitting Saul back, David's first considered, had he wronged Saul? And do we look at a situation, have I wronged this person that's making him say this? Have I done something to offend them? And oftentimes, if you're like me, you can be oblivious to things you do or say. And because I can get very tunnel vision and just walk past people. And I've used that. People come up to my wife and say, hey, is your husband mad at me because he doesn't say hi? And it's no, he only has one rail on his train that he can stay on at a time. And my wife can multitask and do like 20 things at once, and I have to turn 20 things off to do one thing. And even at work, I have to like stop what I'm doing, and sometimes I'll have 5 things going on, and I tell my supervisor, like, I can only do one thing at a time. And another coworker's like, do you know what I learned from the engineers? They just clear their desk of everything and only have one thing in front of them, and that's what they work on. And so I try to do that, but I still have 5 things sitting there and all kinds of stuff. But do we try to make things right? Do we ask ourselves, Lord, show me if there's anything that I've done. Help me to understand. And are we willing to sit down with those that have hurt us to seek to resolve the conflict instead of reacting to it? Do we examine ourselves first and then seek to make peace with the offender? And Matthew 5 verses 23 and 24 says, therefore if thou bring thy gift to the altar, and thou rememberest that thy brother hath aught against thee, leave there thy gift before the altar, and go thy way. First be reconciled to thy brother, and then come and offer thy gift. Matthew 18:15 says, moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. If he shall hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother. Are we willing to pursue reconciliation so that we can gain a brother, or are we risking losing a relationship because we don't want to seek reconciliation? Like, well, they started it, they have to come to me first. And how many times we hear of family conflicts that don't get resolved for years because they each feel they've been offended and don't want to say, hey, I'm sorry. No one likes to eat crow. I've never eaten it, so I don't know what it tastes like, but it's a good saying. But no one likes to say, hey, I'll take the hit. I'll be the one that's guilty. How can we restore this relationship? And how can we have fellowship once again? In Romans 12:18 it says, if be possible as much as light, then you live peaceably with all men. Do we seek that reconciliation? Do we seek to fix what is wrong in a situation, to make things right? And sometimes we may be the one that gets attacked, and we have to be the ones that try to fix the situation with the attacker. So not only do we have to think properly and overcome evil by doing right, but we can overcome evil by letting go. And that's the third point. When we hold on to bitterness, we load ourselves with the unnecessary burdens that weigh us down. Instead of moving forward in God's grace, we get stuck in the past. But if we let go of the hurt and give it to God, we free ourselves from bondage and experience the peace knowing that God is in control. So a lot of times this is one of the harder things. How do we let it go? It's not just a Frozen song. How do we let it go? How do we try to get over this situation? And sometimes there's things, and I know that personally there was a situation that happened years ago, and it took years for me to let this situation go. Every time I saw the person or thought about it, what happened, I would get upset. And how do we let it go so that it doesn't affect us and hinder us from moving forward for the Lord? The first thing we can see from David's life is he recognized the sovereignty of God. What enabled David to rest his case completely in God's hand is that he recognized that God was sovereign, that he was in control, that he had the power to do whatever. And he knew that whatever had happened to him, God had allowed it. And that God has all things under his control. David recognized that Saul was the Lord's anointed, that God had raised Saul to be king, and God could remove Saul from being king. David left control of the situation to God, and he gave the trial as well as Saul's fate to the Lord as well, trusting God to be sovereign in all men's affairs. And we see that in 1 Samuel 24, 6 through 7. And it says, and he said unto his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch forth mine hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. So David stayed his servants with these words and suffered them not to rise against Saul. In 1 Samuel 24:10 it says, behold, this day thine eyes have seen how that the Lord hath delivered thee today unto mine hand in the cave, and some bade me kill thee, but mine eye spared thee. And I said, I will not put forth my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. 1 Samuel 26:10. David said, furthermore, as the Lord liveth, the Lord shall smite him, or his day shall come to die, or he shall descend into battle and perish. As I was just reading this, how many times have we heard the old saying, he's digging his own grave? And do we just allow the Lord to let it all happen and let what they're doing come upon them? Or do we try forcing the matter and getting involved and maybe doing something that the Lord doesn't want us to do? But do we give the situation to the Lord and let him work it out? The Bible talks about the heart of the king is in the Lord's hand. My mind is not working great today, but you guys know the scriptures. But and I can remember that as I was reading that, someone was telling me that the Lord that whoever's in charge, the Lord has control over and will lead them to do different things. And we see that even with Nehemiah, as Nehemiah's burden came to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and he put it on told the king gave him the money, the wherewith to do it. Now, the king wasn't a Jew, he wasn't a Christian, but the Lord put it on his heart to give Nehemiah the funds and everything to do so. And how much more does the Lord have power over the little situation or the big situation in our lives, to have the power over those in charge to direct the path, to say, do you know what? We're going to head this direction. You're like, oh, that's an answer to prayer. That's exactly the direction I wanted to go. And the Lord knows our heart and what we want, and we see how the Lord will give us the desires of our heart when we seek to please Him and do His will. We must remember to let God be God, and that when we realize that He is sovereign, we can trust Him to vindicate us of what the wrong has been done to us. And God will do it in His time and in His way. It's not going to come instantaneous, or sometimes it may be. And we'll see how the Lord will take care of a situation and work things out for the best and help us to grow and have a clear conscience of a heart that's right towards the Lord in the matter. But not only do we see that David recognized the sovereignty of God, he recognized the righteousness of God. Saul had done wrong to David, but David refused to hold it against Saul. And David was willing to give the wrongs to God because he knew that God was a fair judge and that He would set them right. And this is something that's repeated all through Scripture. In Genesis 18:25, at the end of the verse it says, "Shall not the judge of all the earth do right?" Talking about the Lord. And then 2 Timothy 4:8, it says, "The righteous judge shall give me at that day, and not to me only, but unto all them also that love His appearing." Talking about there's a crown of righteousness laid up in store. Are we allowing the Lord, the righteous judge, to handle the matter, to execute the judgment? And sometimes it's not in the timing that we desire, but we know that everything is in the Lord's timing. David's conviction that God is righteous and would judge Saul allowed David not to take matters in his own hand, but to trust God in doing so. In 1 Samuel 24:12 and 13 it says, "The Lord judge between me and thee, and the Lord avenge me of thee, but my hand shall not be upon thee. As saith the proverb of the ancients, wickedness proceedeth from the wicked, but my hand shall not be upon thee." Sometimes the Lord will allow the world to take care of the world, to bring the judgment upon them. And just as the Lord allowed the different nations to oppress Israel when they strayed from the Lord, to judge them, and we see that the Lord worked it all out to bring them back to following Him and serving Him. In 1 Samuel 24:15 it says, "The Lord therefore be judge and judge between me and thee, and see and plead my cause, and deliver me out of thine hand." When we refuse to forgive and hold on to grudges, we doubt God's ability to handle this situation, and we doubt His righteousness. When we fall into the trap of believing that God isn't fair, when we believe this, we think that we need to take these matters into our own hands. God will do right. He'll discipline His children, and He will deal with those who have done wrong. Bitterness does nothing to hurt the other person, but it does everything to damage us. In Hebrews 12:15 it says, "Looking diligently, lest any man fail of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up trouble you, and thereby many be defiled." And has anyone ever heard of the Matador vine?
The what?
The Matador vine. So it's a vine that grows in South America, and I Googled it, because Google is there to look at pictures and see what these things are. But the Matador vine grows up, and it grows as it grows up the tree, it grows into the crevices and slowly kills the tree, and eventually it gets to the very top of the tree, kills the tree, blooms a flower to drop seeds all over everywhere else to do it again. And so, just like bitterness, as we allow it in our lives, it grows up and constricts. It destroys us and doesn't allow us to have the joy that the Lord would have for us. And so if you look at, I think that's why they put it in here. So it's all these things that you never know. And I look at it, the little references, it like comes from like 1,000 Bible illustrations. It's like, they have books like this, huh? But so if you interested, look up the Matador vine. I think it showed like one picture.
I've never heard of it.
So, and then there's like a Matador wine. So it's not the wine, it's the vine. And and so it shows it. And just like a vine, we see it grow, it'll go everywhere. And years ago, as I was thinking about the root of bitterness and the vine here, I was redoing some of our sprinklers in our yard before I got the first water bill and shut it all back off. And I saw this little piece of grass growing out of the sprinkler head. And so I started pulling it, and I had brought it in. It had like this much on top of the grass chute, but it was like 10 feet long down the pipe of this root going for the water. And the Lord was saying, do you see this? This is just like bitterness in your life, that it just roots itself and grows so deep that it's hard to get out. You might only see a little bit, but it's affecting you way down inside. And do we allow the Lord to handle these situations? Do we trust that He's the righteous God and that He's going to bring about the judgment in due time? One of the hardest things that we can do is overcome evil with good. And to become the true victors over these, we need to allow God to handle it and do good to those that hurt us, to do injury to us. Do we respond to our enemy with kindness and demonstrate love, or do we retaliate and not show the love of the Lord in our lives and theirs? When we overcome evil with good, we allow God to work in amazing ways to demonstrate His love to those who do not realize that they even need the love of the Lord in their lives. How many times have we heard someone say or do something because of an act of love that someone did to them? And even as I say that, if you were here when Brother Carlo and his wife was here, do you remember what his wife, what saved his family, what saved her family? It was the act of generosity from her father to the neighbor of giving them some gas. And then he came over and said, I saw your family's name. They're coming for you tonight to kill you. You need to leave. How much do we not see that the Lord's hand is in the situation because of an act of kindness, an act of love, an act of non-retaliation in the situation? And it may even be something years later, someone comes back and says, hey, do you know what? I don't know if you remember this. Years ago, I did this to you out of spite, out of anger, but you responded in kindness and love. And that has stuck with me for all these years, and I found the Lord, or the Lord has used that to teach me something. And the Lord uses that very situation that maybe it hurt you in the moment and you've long since forgot, but the Lord's using that in someone's life for years later. Do we overcome evil with good? So that lesson this morning, when those situations rise up, do we allow the Lord to handle it, or do we plot our vengeance and have a 5-step process on how we're going to get back? Or do we say, Lord, I'm going to let you take care of this. I'm going to do what you led me to do, and I'm going to stick to that until you tell me otherwise. And so that's the lesson this morning on It's Not What You Think, overcoming evil with good. So we'll go ahead and pray, and then there's still a couple minutes to enjoy some snacks and some coffee. I didn't hear a gurgle yet.
Can I
So-
find somebody that is safe right now? Her name is Irene.